The world of post-World War II, the postmodern world, is a world in which there is no longer a predominant tradition. There's no longer a right way to do things. There's no necessary order. There are no acceptable standards. In other words, you can't say that something is beautiful and have everyone agree. Standards are incredibly individual. They're not organized. They're not based on popularity. Art in this time period can be whatever people really want it to be. The standards are up to an individual, and essentially art has three major characteristics in the postmodern world. It has to express oneself, one's point of view, one's personal issues. It should convey a message to someone, challenge your ideas, your traditions, the way you view the world, and get a reaction out of you. Anything that does those three things, expresses a point of view, conveys a message, and gets a reaction, is art in the postmodern world. That means that art can range from very traditional to completely off the wall. Art can be something that would offend one person and delight another. Art does not have limitations. Quickly, I want to show you 4 works of art that illustrate that point. None of these works of art are things that are going to be deeply significant. They're all important, but none of them are perhaps the most popular. But they prove my point about what exactly can be art in the postmodern world. It has to convey a message, express the artist's point of view, and get a reaction. The first of these works of art is by an artist named Serrano. It is titled Piss Christ. It is an image of a plastic crucifix in a jar of the artist's urine. He took a photograph of it. It's valued at over $250,000 and hangs in an art museum. Some people would find this not art. Others would find it deeply offensive. But what I want to show you, the point I want to get across to you, is that in the postmodern world, that counts as art. Why? Because it expresses a point of view, it conveys a message, and it gets a reaction. If it does those 3 things, it counts as art in the postmodern world, in the world after World War II, where we have destroyed standards, where there are no limitations, where beauty is in the eye of the beholder. In the same way, the work of Robert Mapplethorpe. Much of Mapplethorpe's works I can't show you in an academic setting. They're not appropriate. Mapplethorpe is very interested in questions of gender, sexuality, and of the line between the borderline between sexuality and violence. He deals with bondage, dominance, sadomasochism, homosexual themes. His composition is absolutely breathtaking. He works in black and white photography, and he creates truly beautifully put together images. However, those images center on topics like these 2 images that you're looking at, which center on questions of gender identity and masculinity and femininity. He plays with themes that make viewers uncomfortable, things that might not be accepted as art. Earlier generations might have simply found them offensive or even pornographic. And yet in a postmodern world where standards are challenged, these things are artwork under the criteria of the postmodern world. In the same way, an artist named Ophelia, he creates a number of images that cause a crisis at a New York museum because they are images like this. This is the Madonna. She is a very non-traditional Madonna, and that stuff that's over the image are actually chunks of elephant dung. He is expressing his point of view, conveying a message, and getting a response. So his art is truly art. Last but not least, in the postmodern age, this is art. It's by an artist named Hirst. It's called The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. Hirst's message, his question is, why do we have to make things that are dead still appear to be alive? Why do we embalm our dead? Why do we paint them so that they look more lifelike? His artwork is composed of a shark suspended in a tank of formaldehyde. Now, some people would say, well, that's not art. But in terms of postmodern standards, in this particular time period standards, it is. Art in this time period is a matter of taste. World War II destroys the last sense of standard or commonality in art. Instead, art becomes a quest for identity and connection. At the heart of postmodern art is the question, who am I? It is a question that every artist is trying to answer. They're trying to express themselves, to have a voice, to basically cry out and express who they are and begin to understand themselves. On the other side of the equation, they are trying to get a reaction from the viewer, from the person looking at the artwork. They're trying to get an answer from their audience. Perhaps the best way I can explain postmodern art to you, if you've ever seen a picture, a movie, a television show, and it touched you deeply, it moved you emotionally, and someone says, why did that get to you? And you try to put it into words and you can't explain it, it just did. A postmodern artist would say that that was art, because it touched you deeply. It made you begin to answer the question, who am I? Perhaps in a way too deep to even put it into words. Now, postmodernism, postmodern art, comes out of two main philosophies, and I have to briefly talk about both of those philosophies. The first of them is something called existentialism. It is codified, written down, created by a man named Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre actually proposes the idea that there is absolutely no supernatural out there. There is no God, there is no devil, there are no ghosts, there is no human soul, there are no angels, nothing beyond what we can see existing, nothing beyond the world around us. That shift, that concept, changes the way you look at the world. If there is no supernatural, no afterlife, then what you have around you is all you have. And Sartre says that in that world with no supernatural, we are each condemned to be free. Now, that may sound really weird at first because you're like, wait a minute, freedom is good. How are we condemned to be free? I don't get it. Well, Sartre says that from the time we're born, we make choices. Our entire lives are a series of choices. Because we are making choices from the day we are born, those choices all have consequences. Our choices, each one of them, has a long-reaching consequence, sometimes a consequence that we cannot even see the final result of. Those consequences are something we have to live with, and they all come on the basis of our choices, which is why we are condemned to be free. Under existentialism, life is simply seen as absurd. There is no order to it. It is our choice whether to laugh or to cry. Why would someone choose to be an existentialist in a world where there's no supernatural, no absolute truth, where everything in the world is ridiculous? I have a good friend who's an existentialist, and if you ask her why she's an existentialist, she will tell you that it is the only way she can cope with a world where things that the Nazis did exist. In a world where people injected bleach into the eyes of children to see if they would turn blue. Where people forced others to ladle the fat of their friends and family over a fire. How, in her opinion, how can you believe that there is someone in charge, that there is a good supernatural being overseeing the world, that there is order? How can you believe in order in that kind of a world? Therefore, she turns to existentialism because it answers the problem of evil. It explains how those horrible things can happen. Those things can happen because they were the result of choice. There is the dark hope that people will choose to actually do good. In that world, where there is no supernatural, everyone is condemned. Everyone is condemned. Everyone is doomed, condemned to be free, stuck with the consequences of their choices. Existentialists say that each one of us is struggling to connect, but in the end, every man is completely alone. We keep trying to create order. We keep trying to connect with one another, but for an existentialist, in the end, in those moments, we are completely alone. In moments of ultimate joy, when we try to explain our joy to others, we can't explain it because we are ultimately isolated. In moments of our greatest pain, when we look for comfort, we can't find it because we are ultimately isolated. Now that does come through in art. This piece is called Nighthawks. It's by an artist named Hopper, and I'm betting you've seen it before. It's been spoofed, repeated, created over and over again. Hopper says this is aggressively an existentialist piece of art. The image is of a cafe, brightly lit in a city in the middle of the night. Hopper says that only the guy behind the counter has any hope for a future because he's just working there. He's not there because he has no other place to go. The other three people in this picture are there because they are stuck there, forced to be in this situation by the results of their choices. They are condemned to be free, and this is the result of their choice of freedom. Hopper paints each of these people as ultimately isolated. Even the man and the woman sitting side by side, their hands possibly touching, have no apparent awareness of one another. Each one of them is completely isolated and cut off in their own space. This existentialist movement also spawns an entire theater movement called the theater of the absurd. One of the best examples of theater of the absurd is Waiting for Godot. Waiting for Godot is a play which is very sad in one way and really, really funny in another. In Waiting for Godot, there are two characters. Both of them are tragic clowns. They're named Vladimir and Estragon, or Didi and Gogo. And the two of them spend the play on a stage that is completely empty except for a large tree on one side of the stage. The two of them have arrived in this place because they are waiting for Godot. They do not know who Godot is or where Godot is coming from, but they believe that when Godot actually arrives, Godot will tell them what to do. Godot will solve their problems for them and explain what it all means and help them understand. They spend the play waiting for Godot, and of course at the end of the play, Godot never comes. And in fact, they decide to wait for yet another day to see if Godot will then arrive. Now, the play itself is both very, very sad because these guys are waiting for something that's never going to happen. And at the same time, it's hysterically funny. For example, there's one point in the play where Vladimir and Estragon decide that there is no point. The world is chaotic. Godot is not coming. They might as well kill themselves. So they decide to kill themselves by hanging themselves on the tree. They realize they have no rope, and they panic because they can't hang themselves. Eventually, they realize that Vladimir, Didi, is actually wearing a belt made of rope, and they decide to use that bit of rope to hang themselves. The problem is that, well, they have to take it off, and when they do, of course, his pants fall down, which is hysterical. Then they try to get over, and they realize the rope is actually not long enough to hang themselves. It's just this slapstick, ridiculous, very funny situation in this horribly dark and hopeless world. Not everyone, however, is willing and comfortable in accepting existentialism. Some people feel that the isolation is not true, that human beings can connect with one another. And those people create another philosophy, probably one of the most popular and common philosophies in our modern world. That philosophy is called secular humanism. Now, secular humanism starts from the same point as existentialism. There is no supernatural, okay? There is no God, no devil, no demons, no angels, no nothing like that. It then takes one more step. It takes the same step that existentialism does and says there is also no capital T truth. Now, what I mean by capital T truth is that there is no absolute right and wrong. Nothing is always right and nothing is always wrong. For example, most people, if you say, is it wrong to kill an innocent child standing on a street corner? People would say, absolutely, yeah, you don't just walk out and kill a kid. But what if the situation was that if you killed that kid, you could save the lives of 2 million people? Would it then be right to kill the child? Well, that's the kind of questions that secular humanism asks. And the answers of secular humanism is that you do what is best for the greatest number of people. So, truth is not always good and evil. It's not always right and wrong. It changes according to the situation under the ideas of secular humanism. What is good? Good is what benefits the largest number of people. And secular humanism believes that that good and evil is usually determined by science and by mathematics. It comes closest to the truth at a given time. We look at what is good for the majority, and that is where our morality comes from in secular humanist belief. Now, secular humanism doesn't believe in supernatural. So basically secular humanism says this world around us, what you're looking at, this is all we got. This is as good as it's going to get. Because this is all that we have to make this as good as possible. So the main goal of secular humanism is improving the world. How do we make the world a better place? We work together. We cooperate. We do things that will bring the greatest good for the largest amount of people. Secular humanism refuses to condemn anything. It is not a matter of right and wrong. It is not a matter of good and evil. It is not a matter of moral white and black. Instead, for secular humanism, things are a matter of good for the majority, good for the most people. What is good will change, and therefore you can never condemn something as wrong. It is simply different. It is appropriate only in certain circumstances. If you've heard on the news the concept of different cultures, their way of doing things is not wrong, it's just different, and we need to understand their way of doing things and learn to cooperate with them. You've heard secular humanism. If you've heard someone say that a criminal is not bad or evil and they don't really deserve to be punished, they need to be rehabilitated, you've heard secular humanism. This idea that no one is necessarily right and wrong, everyone simply sees things differently, is a deep part of secular humanism, and it comes up in secular humanist-influenced art. Secular humanism gives us art like Jackson Pollock's Number 1. The artwork is called Number 1 because it is abstract expressionism. It is not meant to represent any one thing in particular. In fact, Jackson Pollock actually paints. When he paints, he tries to use his subconscious. He tries to paint something that doesn't really represent anything at all, because he wants everyone to see something in the painting, to get something different out of it. If you look at this and you see a bunch of splatters that look like junk, you're right. If you see a statement about the chaos, disorder, and sadness in our world, you're right. There is no single one right way to view these artworks. There are just different ways to view these artworks, and each way is equally legitimate and equally good. It is the ideas of secular humanism coming out and being manifested in artwork. Another artist by the name of Rothko does the same kind of thing, only he uses deep blocks of color to express that point of view. When you read art critics about Rothko, they talk about people standing in front of Rothko's paintings and weeping because of the intensity of emotion displayed in the colors. Now, perhaps you're like me and you don't see that intensity of emotion coming through. If not, that's okay too. Secular humanism tells us that different points of view are all okay. Each one is equally legitimate. Secular and humanism do have and existentialism do have a strong crossover. They share characteristics and bring art like Segal's bus to light. This artwork, it is a sculpture, shows a number of people in seats, portrayed as if they were riding a bus home. Every one of them is individual. If you look at them, their clothing is different, their pose is different. And yet Segal emphasizes their similarity, how they are faceless copies with no distinct individuality. He's emphasizing their isolation from one another and asking us questions about cooperation, about working together, about whether we can actually create meaning in a world that has suffered through World War I, World War II, and undermined our sense of order, our sense of belief, and our sense of basic dignity and human ideology. Now, these works tap into existentialism, they tap into secular humanism, but they are strictly works of art. There is another type of art which becomes really, really popular in this time period, largely because it is very practical, and people, especially Americans, love practical art. That type of art is actually architecture. Two main types of architecture. The first is called organic art. It is basically summed up by the catchphrase form follows function. The idea behind organic architecture is that buildings should be built to be the best example of what they are supposed to be. For example, a great organic architect called Frank Lloyd Wright is called upon to build a museum. Now, if you've been to a museum, you know that museums are, well, they share a lot in common with those little mazes that they stick rats in and make rats run through. They are choppy, disorganized. They have little rooms. Not all of the art is displayed equally. It's difficult. Now, in that context, Frank Lloyd Wright creates the Guggenheim Museum as a museum whose form follows its function. The museum is designed to show off artwork to the best possible advantage. The inside of the Guggenheim is not a rat maze. The inside of the Guggenheim is actually a long, smooth spiral. You take an elevator to the top of the Guggenheim and you work your way down a long spiral ramp. By the time you reach the bottom of the museum, you have seen every piece of artwork in the museum, and all of them have been displayed equally. That equal showing of artwork expresses the concept of form follows function. It shows everything off equally and expresses the final goal or the final concept of organic architecture by displaying everything in the perfect way. It is the structure that best expresses what a museum is actually supposed to be. In another work of architecture called Falling Water, Frank Lloyd Wright once again shows that form follows function. Falling Water is a home, and yet it is a home that is seamlessly integrated into its natural environment. Wright wanted to create a home that was not disruptive, but fit in with the world around it, smoothly and seamlessly matching the landscape. It was intended to be the best example of a home in nature. Its form was supposed to follow its function, and if you look at the layout, you can see that Falling Water actually follows the flow of the landscape, reaching over a waterfall and integrating all of the beautiful views and landscape into the home. Its form, the shape of the house, reflects its function of fitting into its environment rather than disrupting it. Anything an artist can imagine, whatever its function is intended to be, organic architecture makes its shape match its function. Even here with the dancing house in Prague, the architect was inspired to make a structure that looked like two dancers. That structure, its form followed that idea. Its form followed its function. And the result was something quirky, something beautiful, something deeply organic that matched the ideas of organic architecture. The second style of architecture is called Bauhaus architecture. For Bauhaus architecture, less is more. It is as simple and as streamlined as possible. For a Bauhaus architect, the Seagrams building in New York City is the perfect building. It is functional, it is simple, it does everything it needs to do with a minimum of fuss, expressing the most basic, elegant form through its simple structure. Even in creating a museum, a Bauhaus architect wants to create simple lines, no more than is required to express the elegance of a museum and give enough space to properly display the artwork.